Buenos dias. Once again, I had to come inside. The neighbor was mowing the lawn for this one. So we're talking about our second uh, packet here for second article for the U.S. relationship with Cuba. This is pretty much all about the Cuban Missile Crisis. Notice I was wearing the red Cuban jersey in the last article reading. I switched into the white one. I got Jose Abreu's number on the back, Cuban flag right here. If a lot of people, when they first look at it, they think it's a Cubs jersey because CUB, but Cuba, not Cubs. Anyway, just like to show it off. It's one of my favorite jerseys that I own. So let's take a look at this one. Like I told you in the last video, the Cuban Missile Crisis is the closest the United States has ever come to World War III. And as a result, that's one of those things where what seems like, this little tiny country of Cuba somehow has this huge effect on world relations. And it was never more true than in 1962. So let's take a look. And if you could, please follow along while I read. The Cuban Missile Crisis, October 1962. Estrella Roja sobre Cuba. After Cuba's revolution in 1959, relations with the USA steadily declined. Fidel Castro nationalized most businesses on the island, which ended whatever positive relationship Cuba had with the American business community. He imprisoned or executed anyone whom he considered a Batista supporter and dealt viciously with anyone who did not support his revolution. The American government at first supported Castro's takeover because the USA realized Batista no longer had the support of the people. Castro also seemed willing to work with the US. After he took over, though, his real plans became much more clear. Castro denied many times that he was a communist. Che Guevara was one of his top advisors, though. Che was openly a communist and in a position of great power under Castro, so he was obviously sympathetic to communist teachings. His seizure of American businesses was the final straw, and Castro openly turned against the U.S. The Bay of Pigs invasion. Many Cubans were also turning against Castro. There were many who supported him in the revolution, but were alarmed at his lack of concern for civil rights once he took power. To many, he was an even more ruthless version of Batista. Thousands of Cubans left the island to escape Castro, many settling in Miami, Florida, which became a hotbed of anti-Castro feeling. The American CIA had a plan. They began arming and training a group of 1,500 anti-Castro Cubans that were living in Miami. This group became known as Brigade 2506. The CIA hoped to have Brigade 2506 invade Cuba, much like Castro's 26th of July movement did back in 1956. From there, they hoped people would eventually turn on Castro the way they had turned on Batista. The plan began under President Eisenhower, but was ready to launch under newly elected President John F. Kennedy. The CIA informed Kennedy of the brigade's existence in February 1961, and he instructed them to keep getting it ready. Keep in mind, Kennedy was inaugurated in January of 1961, so this literally was just like a month after he became president that this happened, or about 3 months by the time the invasion actually happened. In April 1961, Brigade 2506 was ready to attack. They sailed from their training ground in Guatemala to a jungle area on the southern coast of Cuba called the Bay of Pigs. Once there, the brigade began to wade ashore, but the Cuban army was waiting for them. Castro's agents knew all about the brigade and expected them. Meanwhile, in Washington, D.C., the CIA asked Kennedy for airstrikes from the U.S. Navy to help the struggling brigade. Kennedy did not want to commit American troops to the battle and refused to authorize the airstrikes. The Navy did come close to shore to try to pick up as many Brigade 2506 members fleeing the beach as they could, but many fell into the hands of the Cuban army in the swamps further inland. The Bay of Pigs invasion was a disaster for Brigade 2506 and an embarrassment for the United States, who obviously sponsored it. It also convinced Castro that he needed more than his own army to maintain his control of Cuba. And there you see some guys from Brigade 2506 on the left, and there's Castro, Fidel with the glasses on inside a tank during the Bay of Pigs. Moscow on the Melecon. After the Bay of Pigs, Castro began to openly ask the Soviet Union for support against the Americans. Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev was only too happy to help out. The Americans had allies surrounding the Soviet Union since World War II, including nuclear missiles in Turkey, right on the Soviet border. If the Soviets could return the favor and place Soviet missiles right in the American front yard, then the entire world situation would change. It would also guarantee the Americans would not invade Cuba again. In truth, Khrushchev underestimated the American response. He believed the Americans would strongly dislike missiles so close to them, but would put up with them just as he put up with the American ones in Turkey. He also believed he could keep them a secret until the sites were already built in Cuba. He certainly did not believe the Americans would risk war over them. Until hell freezes over. On October 14th, 1962, an American U-2 spy plane photographed what appeared to be Soviet missile installations under construction on the island of Cuba. To accept Soviet missiles in Cuba was unthinkable to President Kennedy. To invade Cuba, though, invited the possibility of a nuclear conflict. Attacking the sites was briefly considered, and what most close to the president believed would eventually have to happen. Kennedy, however, chose to establish a quarantine, we've heard that word lately, or blockade of Cuba. He would surround Cuba with the U.S. Navy, forbidding any ships carrying weapons to Cuba from getting to the island. Critics pointed out that the blockade did nothing to remove the missiles already on Cuba, but it was an alternative short of war, so the U.S. tried it first. What was not known until the 1990s was that several Soviet missile batteries were already operational and could have launched at any time. Some Soviet ships attempted to run the blockade, but were stopped with warning shots from the U.S. Navy. The Soviet captains were under strict orders not to let things escalate to full battle. By this time, the Soviets were secretly shocked and scared at how far the Americans were prepared to go to see the missiles removed. Castro was not shocked. Having dealt with the Americans and knowing how much they dominated the Americas, he was prepared to go to war. Repeatedly, he urged Khrushchev to launch the missiles, even though it would mean the destruction of his own country. Khrushchev would do no such thing. 1 minute to midnight. Using any method of communication possible, President Kennedy and Premier Khrushchev negotiated to end the standoff. With the world watching, Soviet ships steamed toward Cuba and the U.S. Navy's guns faced them. Tensions went even higher when a U.S. plane was shot down by a Soviet surface-to-air missile. Critics of President Kennedy shrieked that the Soviets had now spilled American blood, and the USA had done nothing to respond. Meanwhile, unknown to the Americans, Khrushchev and the Soviet leaders were horrified when they learned of the downed plane. The commander fired at the American plane, even though he was supposed to get precise orders from the Soviet leadership before doing so. The situation seemed to be spinning out of control. And there you see a newspaper kind of showing that the whole situation is very close to war. That same day, Khrushchev sent Kennedy a letter in which he urged the two countries to relax, saying, "Mr. President, we and you ought not pull on the ends of the rope in which we have tied the knot of war, because the more the two of us pull, the tighter that knot will be tied. And a moment may come when that knot will be tied so tight that even he who tied it will not have the strength to untie it." With that, the Soviets promised to remove the missiles if the U.S. promised not to invade. The next day, Kennedy announced the agreement to the world. So, in the end, Soviets backed down, removed the missiles, everybody kind of relaxed, and it turned out that nothing really happened for the most part. But it was very, very close for a period of about 2 weeks in 1962. Everybody was convinced that we were going to war pretty much any moment. The next day it would be happening. So a very scary time in world history, and very dangerous time in world history, because it could have easily gone the other direction if you didn't have two leaders of the countries, the U.S. and the Soviet Union, that were kind of committed to finding a way out of the mess that they sort of got themselves into in the first place. If cooler heads didn't prevail, it might have gotten much, much uglier than that, and we may not be here today. So you've got your worksheet that you're going to be working on for this one. Good luck on it. If you have any questions, please don't hesitate to send me an email. Okay? I will talk to you later. Take it easy.